Hello, my name is Catherine Sibert, and this is a pre-recorded talk for the virtual 2021 CogSci conference titled The Role of the Basal Ganglia in the Human Cognitive Architecture, a Dynamic Causal Modeling Comparison Across Tasks and Individuals. A quick literature search for the basal ganglia will find a huge array of studies, many of which are associated with memory, particularly working memory, but the basal ganglia seems to be involved in a vast array of cognitive functions and conditions. But while there is quite a bit of agreement on what exactly the basal ganglia does and that it interacts with a lot of different brain functions, there is a bit of disagreement about the exact mechanisms through which it interacts with all of these things. There are some common elements. Everyone seems to agree that the basal ganglia receives a lot of the dopamine signals in the brain, particularly when making reward predictions, and that it is heavily involved in learning associated processes. And in addition, the basal ganglia receives projections from all different areas of the cortex. And in addition to receiving projections, the basal ganglia also makes projections of its own, primarily back to the prefrontal cortex. The main source of disagreement is exactly how these projections are being made. And there are two main schools of thought. The first is that the basal ganglia has direct connections to the prefrontal cortex in that it sends a series of independent messages to the various cortical areas. But an alternate explanation is that the basal ganglia could serve a more modulatory function, that it determines which signals reach the prefrontal cortex or the strength of the signals, and that it acts as a sort of gating mechanism. Now, when the basal ganglia gets incorporated into larger scale models of cognition, the tendency is to choose one or the other of these explanations. But our goal was to really investigate the individual connections of the basal ganglia rather than considering it as a single component in a larger model. So we wanted to come up with a modeling domain and structure that would allow us to implement alternate configurations of a basal ganglia being connected to other cortical regions in different ways and directly compare the predictions and performance of those models. So the domain that we looked at was the interpretation of brain signals, or efforts to make predictions about what brain activity will look like in particular regions of interest based off of the onset and type of external events that are happening out in the environment, like the presentation of a stimulus. And one of the regions that can be examined with these types of models is the basal ganglia. Now, the traditional approach for this kind of signal interpretation is a general linear model where direct connections are drawn between the external events and activity in the regions. But this tends to treat that activity as being independent and fully driven by that external activity. Whereas we believe that most brain regions, including the basal ganglia, are all interconnected, particularly if we are looking at the difference between a direct or a modulatory connection. So in order to capture some of the network dynamics of an underlying cognitive structure, we use a method called Dynamic Causal Modeling, which does the same sort of signal interpretation using the same regions and external events, but it allows for a network of both direct and indirect connections to predict activity propagating through a brain network. And this will allow us to connect the region representing basal ganglia activity to the rest of the network in a both indirect and direct manner. But in order to really look at these variations in structure, we need to have some base structure of whole brain cognition so that we can look at the variations of basal ganglia connections. And the structure that we started with is based on the Common Model of Cognition, which is a high-level theoretical account of whole brain cognition that tries to be a consensus architectural model based on decades of cognitive architecture research. It identifies 5 major components of cognition: perception, action, working memory, long-term memory, and most relevant for this talk is procedural memory, closely associated with the basal ganglia. It theorizes a network of connections of how these regions communicate with each other, and it also locates each region in a particular area of the brain. So using the common model structure, we can make predictions using the dynamic causal modeling analysis. And then we can vary the ways in which the procedural memory component is connected to the rest of the network to compare these different accounts of basal ganglia connectivity. So the typical methodological pipeline for dynamic causal modeling has 4 steps. First, we determine the specific regions of interest that we are going to try and make predictions about. We connect those ROIs together using the network structure of choice. We provide some set of inputs to this network and make predictions about what brain activity will look like, and then we compare the quality of those predictions across our different candidate network structures. So the first step is to determine the specific regions of interest that we are going to use in our analysis. The common model posits that or separates the brain into 5 large regions from which to select our specific regions. So each of these regions is broadly associated with one of the 5 components of the model. And the precise region of interest that gets used for any given individual in any task in the analysis is simply the most active voxel or point within that large region. And a particular note for this talk, that the procedural memory component is pretty much located smack dab in the middle of the basal ganglia. So we can draw a direct connection between the procedural memory component and the basal ganglia. The second step is to now connect these components together. And we have 3 variations of our models. The first is a direct model, which is the base common model structure where all components are connected with only direct connections. And in particular, the connections to note are the connections to and from the procedural component, which is essentially between the procedural component and the working memory component. So that's our base direct model. Our second candidate model is a modulatory model where we remove the direct connection between procedural memory and working memory. Procedural still receives input from working memory, but its output goes not to any direct component, but it modulates the strength of other components, specifically those between the perceptual component and working memory and long-term memory and working memory. And our third candidate model is a mixed model where we have both the direct connections and the modulatory connections. Our third step is now that we have our different network structures, we have to give it some set of input and use those networks to make slightly different predictions about activity. So for this, we want our model to make good predictions across a wide variety of domains. So we looked at a set of 6 different tasks collected in the Human Connectome Project database. We took 200 subjects and looked at their performance in tasks across a wide variety of domains. But each task had 2 different conditions. These conditions were either easy, so just a simple processing of the stimuli would be the beginning of the network. Easy tasks drive activity directly only in the perceptual region. And hard tasks might require memory of the task instructions, which is reflected by having them drive input directly in the perceptual region as well as the working memory region. And with that, we have all the pieces we need to make good predictions about activity, and we can now compare the predictions across our 3 different model types. Our results show that across all tasks that we looked at, the mixed model is the most likely to make the best quality predictions for any of our subjects in any of the tasks. However, what is interesting to note is that the second best model and the extent to which the mixed model is dominant changes across tasks, which suggests that the basal ganglia is a more flexible system that is adapting to task demands, and that it is capable of using both connections, but different types of tasks might lean more heavily on one type or the other. And so our big takeaway is that rather than having one or the other system between direct or modulatory connections, the brain is capable of having both connections, and there is some ability to switch between. A potential future direction could incorporate some ideas about a conditional model, which suggests that initially, modulatory connections are used when the task is unfamiliar, but with practice, the switch is made to direct. Alternately, it may be that some tasks are simply better suited to different types of connectivity. And then more broadly, this project fits into a more general project aimed at exploring the common model and how it is able to provide a reasonable account of underlying brain activity, and that using the common model as a structure through which to do dynamic causal modeling analysis of brain activity gives us the opportunity to really interrogate the intricacies of how this underlying structure of cognition is constructed. And with that, I would like to thank my co-authors and collaborators, as well as all of you for your attention. Thank you.